Hi everyone, Ian here, and in today's video I want to show you my updated CST workflow and how it interacts with some additional node parameters which I frequently use, such as the Kodak 2383 film print and the film look creator, which was recently announced in DaVinci Resolve 19. So let's dive in and begin setting up a project. Now, before we make any adjustments in the node tree or the system settings, I just want to let you know about the monitor preferences that I have. So I'm using a monitor which is set to 6500 Kelvin, for which an LCD's monitor is the correct color temperature for color grading and video editing. And I've also got my gamma set as gamma 2.2. And that's because I normally deliver to platforms which are online, such as YouTube. And I'm normally viewing these on monitors and tablets and laptops and desktops. So 2.2 is the correct gamma to set for that kind of deliverable. And I need to make sure that this is also set correctly in my DaVinci system settings. So to do that, I'm going to go to this cogwheel and I'm going to go to the color management page. And first, I'm going to look at the timeline color space. And this will normally be set as something like Rec 709. And I'm going to change this to DaVinci Wide Gamma Intermediate. Now, DaVinci Wide Gamma Intermediate is a wider color space and it provides more flexibility for comprehensive color grading. And a lot of people who shoot with log footage normally prefer to use DaVinci Wide Intermediate when they're doing any kind of color correction or color grading, because it provides and allows for a broader range of colors to be captured and displayed, which can then result in more realistic and detailed images. So this is normally the one that I pick. Now, our output color space needs to match our deliverable color space, and that's going to be gamma 2.2. So we have Rec 709 gamma 2.2 here, so I'll click on this and then I can hit save. Now, before we start building our node tree and adding CSTs into here, I just want to turn on some proxies or turn on some optimized media. And that's because a lot of the footage that I'm using is 6K or 4K raw footage, and that's going to be quite intensive on the computer. So utilizing some form of proxy workflow is always going to be beneficial when working with these larger project files. Now, in DaVinci Resolve, we have two options. We either have optimized media or we have traditional proxy media. To enable these, I'm just going to go to my media page and I'm going to go to my Blackmagic Gen 5 raw clips. And we're just going to do it on this first clip here. Now, if we want to generate optimized media, we right click on it and we go to Generate Optimized Media. This will begin the optimization process, and this is specifically optimized for Resolve and may create bigger file sizes, but it's going to work very efficiently within Resolve. And this is DaVinci Resolve's own versions of proxies. If we wanted to create more traditional proxy media, we could right click and instead we would go to Generate Proxy Media. And these could be utilized across different platforms such as Premiere or Avid. Now, this proxy media is going to go to a specific folder location, and you'll be able to find where these go and what they're set up as by going to the system settings, and in the master settings, you'll see an optimized media and render cache, and you'll see that you can pick your proxy media resolution and proxy media format. Normally, I pick a ProRes format because I'm working on a Mac, and I'll pick LT or proxy. And we can also pick our optimized media resolution and optimized media format. And again, I choose a ProRes 422 LT or proxy. Now, these different types of optimized and proxy media will go to different locations. The proxy files will go to the proxy generation location, which you can browse and set a folder as, and I normally set this to a specific proxy folder within my folder structure. The optimized media will go to the cache file location. So if I open up my Finder, we'll see that I have a DaVinci project, and in here I have a cache folder, and in here is my optimized media. And I have a proxy files folder, and this is where my proxy media is. So this is where these are both set when you generate them. Now to turn these on, if I go back to my color page, we've created some proxy and optimized media for this particular clip. I can go to the playback, and in here you'll see used optimized media, if available, is automatically selected. So if you have generated optimized media, it will automatically turn on. If you wanted to turn on the proxies, you could go to the proxy handling and you could choose prefer proxies. When this happens, you'll see that we have a little proxy icon next to the clip, and that means our proxies are now turned on. Personally, I normally use optimized media instead of proxies, but it's entirely up to you, and it means we're going to have a much more efficient way of working when doing color correction and color grading and when adding textures in DaVinci Resolve. Okay, so now we've got our proxy media set up for this and our optimized media set up, let's start building the node structure. So first, this little green dot represents our initial camera input, so the file coming from the camera, and in this instance we have a Blackmagic RAW clip which was filmed in the film log profile. Toward the end of the node tree, this is going to be our final output and our final deliverable. So what it's going to look like when it goes onto our platforms such as YouTube. And in between, we can begin to build the node structure. Now we'll have a node created automatically at first, which we can click on and move around. And I'm just going to right click on this and go to the node label, and I'm going to put IDT for input device transform /DWG DaVinci wide gamut. I'm then going to create a second node by holding Alt and pressing S and drag that toward the end of the node tree. I'm going to right click on it, and this one is going to be called DWG DaVinci wide gamut to ODT output device transform. And this is going to be our location for setting our color space transforms. Now when we want to add a color space transform, we can go up to this effects area and into the search tool, and when we just search for color, you'll see color space transform appears. We can favorite this if we need to, so we can easily access it, and I'm going to drag this onto both the IDT and the ODT. And you'll see that when I click on both, we now have these additional parameters available, and this is going to allow us to transform our log file into a color corrected image. So first, let's look at IDT. We have our input color space, and this means what was the profile that we shot in the camera. Well, I know for my input color space for this particular shot, I captured it in Blackmagic Design wide gamut Gen 4/Gen 5, and I know that my input gamma was Blackmagic Film Gen 5. Now, when I select this, you'll see that the image shifts and changes slightly, but it won't yet look correct. And that's because we haven't changed our output color space and output gamma on the IDT, and we currently haven't changed anything in the ODT. So back to the IDT, we've set our camera profile settings. Next, we're going to set our output color space and output gamma. And this is asking us where our file is going to for editing. Well, it's going to the DaVinci Resolve timeline, and we know that our DaVinci Resolve timeline is set to DaVinci wide gamut intermediate as our timeline color space. So I need to set the color space to DaVinci wide gamut and DaVinci intermediate. And again, you'll see that this will adjust the clip, but it won't yet look correct. We'll then go to the ODT, and again, it's going to ask for the input color space and input gamma. And this means what have we been editing on throughout this node pipeline? Well, once again, we've been editing on the DaVinci wide gamut intermediate, so we're going to set our input color space as DaVinci wide gamut and DaVinci intermediate. And then it's going to ask for our output color space and output gamma. Now this means what is our end deliverable going to be? And again, when we go to our setup, our deliverable and our output color space is Rec 709 Gamma 2.2. So I'm going to choose Rec 709 and then Gamma 2.2. And you'll see that we now have a color corrected image, and if your exposure was correct during the time of recording, your exposure will also be correct during that color conversion. Okay, so now we've performed our initial CST color correction, and we can now add additional nodes in between the IDT and the ODT to create a color grade and to add textures. So I'm just going to take you through my basic node tree, which I've been utilizing for a while. And this one is based on Darren Mostyn's node structure. And I find it really simple and easy to use and really efficient. If you haven't checked out Darren Mostyn's videos, please do, as he's an amazing colorist and I've personally learned so much. But this node structure is simple, easy to use, it's efficient, and you can see where all your parameters are and you can make adjustments very quickly. So first I'm going to add a new serial node by holding Alt and pressing S. I'm going to right click on this and change the node label, and I'm going to set this one as balance/exposure. This is going to be used for making adjustments to our lift, gamma and gain, i.e. our shadows, midtones and our highlights. I'm then going to add another node and I'm going to call this one contrast. I'm then going to add a third node, and this one is going to be called saturation. Once I've done this, I'm going to add one more serial node, and then I'm going to hold Alt and press P, and I'm going to create a parallel node. And you'll see that these are slightly different to the linear serial nodes. They're running parallel to one another. For this one, I'm going to call this temp for temperature, and the one below I'm going to select and call HDR. Once I've done that, I'm going to click on this next node and then add a new serial node, and I'm going to use this one as a global node or a trim node. This one is going to allow me to make global adjustments to all of the previous nodes. Once I've got my global node, I'm going to add one more serial node, and then I'm going to change this into a parallel node. I'm going to hold Alt and press P, and I'm now going to create 3 new parallel nodes, and I use these ones for masking. I'm going to right click the node label, and I'm going to call this one PW1 for power window 1, and the second one PW2 for power window 2, and then the third one is PW3 for power window 3. After this node, I'm then going to add one more serial node, and this one is going to be called FLC for Film Look Creator. This is going to be where we add some additional textures such as halation and grain and bloom. And then we have our ODT at the end, and this is my basic node structure. There are some additional nodes which I also add onto this, specifically for the film print, which I'll come onto in a little bit, but this is my initial node structure. Now, what I normally do before making any adjustments to these additional nodes is I'll take a still grab, and I'll do that by right-clicking on the image and choosing Grab a Still, and when I do this and I open the gallery, that still frame will appear inside it. Now, this allows me to save this entire node structure and very easily move it onto additional clips. If I wanted to export this onto my hard drive and then use it across other projects as well, I could right click on it and go to export. And I'd want to select DRX file, and I'm just going to name it New Basic Node Structure. And I'm going to save it in my node structure folder. Now this is saved, I would then be able to re-import it into different projects. So once I've got this saved, I can click onto a different clip, And if I want to add the same node structure onto this new clip, I can take that still and I can drag and drop it. And you'll see that it automatically is then inserted into the node structure. However, when I open my effects, you'll see that while the ODT is correct in terms of its input color space and output color space, the IDT is incorrect because I still have it set to the Blackmagic film profile, and this particular clip is Canon Log 3. So to adjust this, I'll simply go to my input color space and I'll choose Canon Cinema Gamut, and I'll go into my input gamma and I'll choose Canon Log 3. And you'll now see that I'll have an automatic correction for this particular type of gamma curve. And if I'm turning this on and off, you'll see that very quickly we can create a technical color correction. Same on the original clip, we have a correct color correction and exposure correction. Now, if I wanted this node structure and the IDT to go onto another clip without having a specific camera chosen, I could simply go to my IDT and I could set this back to use timeline for both the input color space and input gamma. I could choose to grab a still, and then when I go onto a different clip and I open my gallery and drag this onto a clip, you'll see that now the IDT just says use timeline for the input color space and the input gamma. And I know this shot was filmed on Sony S-Log 3. So I could go into here and I could find my correct color space, which for this one will be sgamut3.cine. And then the input gamma was S-Log 3. When I select those, we can now see that we have a correct color correction for S-Log 3 footage. And again, the ODT doesn't need to change because our delivery is still the same, Rec 709 Gamma 2.2. So we can see by adding this node structure, we get a very quick and accurate color correction. But what if you've got a difficult exposure? So say you've done your CST workflow and you've created your IDT and ODT and you've done a technical color correction, but now you need to start making adjustments to specific areas of the frame. Perhaps some areas are too dark or some areas are too bright, or perhaps the color temperature is completely wrong. How do we then make adjustments to this? Well, this is where our individual node structures come into play. For example, on this shot, this is Canon Log 3, and this is an XAVC codec. And this is a regular codec and isn't a RAW file. So for this, I can go onto my balance and exposure, and I can then go to one of my color wheels. And within here, we have our lift, which is our shadows, our gamma, which is our midtones, and our gain, which is our highlights. And our offset combines all three. And we can make adjustments to the color of the shadows, the midtones, and highlights. And we can also adjust the luminosity or the brightness via these black scroll wheels at the bottom. So if I wanted to do a balance and exposure, I could take my shadows and I could crush them, or I could bring them up more. I could do the same with my midtones, and I could do the same with my highlights. And this will be adjusting the entire frame. But we can see with this particular clip that we have a very bright spot in the middle here where the sun was capturing the temple. So how can we choose this specific area? Well, for example, because I have power windows here, I could go into PW1 and I could choose a masking tool and I could select my circular mask. And when I select this, I can bring it over to that location and I can adjust and feather it. And you'll see that on the node, it's letting me know which area I'm adjusting. Now, if I try to make an adjustment, for example, in the shadows, you'll see that I'm now adjusting that specific area. If I wanted to reset this at any point, I could just use this little reset icon. If I wanted to invert the mask, I could go here and click the inversion tool, and you'll see that it inverts on the node and it's showing which part of the scene you're adjusting. So we want to adjust the inside of the mask. So I'm just going to make this a little bigger, and because this is a brighter region, I don't really want to be using the shadows because it isn't appropriate to that particular location. I want to be using the highlights. And it could be that in the primary color wheels, this highlight function is a bit too intense. And if that's the case, then I have the option to choose this HDR area. This area allows me to pinpoint the shadows, or the dark, shadow and light areas more appropriately, and I can now bring down the highlights just a little bit in that area. And if I turn this on and off, you'll see that this is bringing down those highlights quite significantly. And because we're adjusting the mask on one particular node, and we've adjusted the overall exposure and balance on a different node, it means that we can easily make alterations to small specific areas without it necessarily affecting other things that we may have changed. For example, if I wanted to adjust my saturation, I don't need to do it on the same node that I previously used. I can do it on a dedicated node. And if I accidentally go too far with my saturation, I can easily reset the saturation by just double clicking on it, and it's not going to affect any other areas that I've previously changed. So for example, I can just bring up this saturation a little bit on there, and then on my balance and exposure, I can go back and I can bring down the shadows just a little bit and the midtones a little bit. So we can now make very accurate adjustments to specific locations via this node structure. And you may not use every node that you've created within the node structure, but it's giving you a good sequence which allows you to go through that correct process of creating a color correction, creating some balance and exposure adjustments, changing your contrast and saturation, and then adding masks if you need to do that in specific areas of the frame. But this is a regular type of file. This is an XAVC file. This isn't a RAW file. What could we do if we had a RAW clip and we needed to make adjustments? Well, we could of course still use this traditional node structure, but we could also utilize some of the camera's RAW settings as well. For example, let's go to this clip. On this clip here, this was shot with the red Komodo. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add my still to create my node structure. I'm going to go to my IDT, and I know that this was filmed on red wide gamut RGB. And I know that this was filmed with red log 3G10. So once we've added the IDT, you'll see that when this was filmed, the color temperature was incorrect, and it's incredibly warm, and much warmer than it should be. And if we needed to make adjustments to this, we could either use the temperature node and use our primary wheels to make adjustments, or because it's a RAW file, we could use the camera RAW settings, and the camera RAW settings are going to give us more adjustability and more accuracy, because we'll be changing that color temperature as if we were still on set making those adjustments. And that's different to changing the temperature in a traditional node tree. For example, if I use my node structure and I attempt to change the temperature, when I drag this and try to change it to a more normal temperature, you'll see that we start to get more of a magenta shift in the color profile. And that's because the initial temperature when we recorded the clip is far too warm, and the camera's color temperature was much further away from the light's color temperature. So to make adjustments to this, we can instead use this camera raw area. And you'll see initially all of this will be grayed out, but we can go to the project and we can go to clip, and it then allows us to see and make adjustments to many of those parameters. Now, normally I don't tend to change a lot of raw settings. I try and get it right in camera as much as possible, but color temperature is a really useful raw parameter to be able to adjust. And we can see that as I drag this up and down, we're going to be able to adjust that color temperature and get a much more accurate color temperature adjustment through using those raw settings. So if you're using a raw file, you have this raw adjustability available to you. And if you're just using a traditional Kodak, such as ProRes or a H.264 file, then you'll be using your node structure to change all of your elements. You can of course use the node structure and the raw files as well. It just may be that certain parameters such as color temperature you decide to change in the camera raw settings as opposed to the node structure settings, because they may allow you to have more accuracy. Okay, so once we've created our node structure and we've created our CST workflow and we've made adjustments to the overall scene and we're happy with how the scene looks, we can then start adding a film print emulation. Now, a classic film emulation print which is used quite often is the Kodak 2383 film stock. And to enable this, you've got to follow a specific node tree structure, because if you don't, it won't look correct. So how do we do this? Well, the Kodak 2383 film print must be placed after the NCST node. And this is based off a Cineon log color space and not a Rec 709 color space. And because of this, we need to move our image from the Rec 709 output to a Cineon output. So to do this, I'm going to add a serial node after the ODT, and I'm going to right click on it and I'm going to call it Cineon. After that, I'm going to get a color space transform and drop it onto it. And I'm going to make adjustments to the input color space and the input gamma. Now our input color space is going to be our output color space and gamma from the ODT. So our input color space needs to be Rec 709 and gamma 2.2. And you'll see that this will change your image again. Our output gamma then needs to be set as Cineon film log. And this will once again change the shot. And we're going to fix this in a minute and make it look correct once we add a compound node. Now after this node, we're going to add another node, and we're going to call this one Kodak or KD 2383. And we're going to add the Kodak film print LUT to this node, and we can do this by either right clicking on the node and going to LUT and going down to film looks and finding the specific Kodak print, or we can open up our LUT page and we can go down to our specific film look, and if you have any favorited, you can place them into here as well. And we can go into our film looks and we can pick the specific Kodak print. And you'll see you have different ones. You have a D55, you have a D60, and you have a D65. If I grab the D60 and I drop it onto the clip, it's going to make an adjustment. And I can then close this LUT. Now, once this is done, you'll see that the film print will be quite harsh on the clip, and we'll need to decrease this intensity to make it look correct. To do this, we need to highlight both the Cineon and the Kodak 2383 film print. We need to right click on them, and we need to go to Create Compound Node. And once it does this, it's going to link it to the ODT and to the Rec 709 color space. When we then want to make adjustments to this film print, we want to go down to this keying window, and where it says key output and where it says gain, we can then adjust this by making it less intense or more intense. And I normally have this set closer to a lower region as opposed to a higher region. You'll now see when I turn this on and off, it's adding a subtle and slight adjustment to the color grade and the tones. Now, once we've added this film print, we can of course go back to any of our node parameters and we can start making additional adjustments. So for example, on my balance, if I wanted to deepen the shadows a little bit, I could, but if I wanted to bring up the highlights a little bit, I could also do this. If I wanted to go into my saturation and increase that, I can do so here. I can then work with the additional nodes alongside the film print. And again, if I then want to change the film print, I of course can. So that's how you correctly add the Kodak 2383 film print onto your node structure. Once you'd added that film print, you could of course take a still frame from it, and that would appear in your gallery, and then you'd have a new node structure with that film print emulation added, and with that you could export it and utilize it across other projects. Okay, so the final thing I want to show you is the new Film Look Creator tool, which was introduced in DaVinci Resolve 19. And that's why I've got this additional node parameter here. So to find this, we're going to go to our effects, to our search box, and we're going to search for film. We're going to drag this Film Look Creator onto the FLC. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go to presets, and we're going to go down to clean slate. This will mean that all of the parameters in the Film Look Creator tool will be disabled and won't be turned on across your image. And you'll see as I disable this particular node that no changes are occurring to the shot. Now it's really important that you put the Film Look Creator node before the ODT and not after the ODT. If you put this after the ODT, then it's going to affect some of the colors in your image, even if you have the clean slate selected. So for example, if I hold Command and click on the FLC and I drag it over to the ODT, this is going to switch the nodes. So now the ODT is before and the FLC is after. And you'll notice that even when I have the clean slate selected, when I disable the FLC, you'll see that the image is actually changing. So the node is affecting the image even though we have a clean slate selected. So you want to make sure that this FLC is set before the ODT. And again, if you ever need to switch nodes like this, you just hold down Command, click on the node and drag it to the other node and it will switch them around. So again, just make sure the FLC is set before the ODT. And that then means that no color adjustments will occur across your image when you have clean slate selected. Okay, so first off, we've ensured our clean slate is selected, and then we have our color blend and our effects blend. And when these are set to 1, it means all these parameters will be available in the Film Look Creator. And if we change this to 0, you'll see that it will turn off specific areas, and we won't be able to make adjustments to those particular parameters. So the color blend refers to the color settings, while the effects blends refer to things such as vignettes, our halation, bloom, and grain effects. We can also turn on the 3D LUT compatibility, and that means it's only going to show us parameters that will be allowed to go onto a LUT if we were to export that LUT and use it across a camera. Normally I have this unticked so I can make all of my adjustments. We then have this color space overrides, and as I mentioned, this is essentially a built-in CST, and normally I have my CST settings on an individual IDT node and an individual ODT node, so I don't tend to change any parameters in here. We then have a film look area with a film look blend. And you'll see that when I increase or decrease this, it's going to adjust the image's color, and it's going to add a core look to it. And if I put this all the way to 1, it's going to be very obvious as we start changing them. And you'll see that as I begin to go across different profiles, for example, Rochester, Akasaka, then we have Elated and Vintage, you'll see it changes the image. Now apparently the Rochester one is referring to a Kodak film stock, and the Akasaka is referring to a Fujifilm stock. And I sometimes have these selected, but I rarely have them all the way at their full intensity. I normally have them at a lower value, especially if I'm using my Kodak 2383 film print, because that's already giving me my glossy contrast film print emulation. So on my film look creator, if I'm using this film look blend, I'll normally have it at a lower value. We then also have these core settings for exposure and contrast and highlights. Again, I tend to change these on an individual node by node basis. However, if you want to go in and change areas within this specific space, you of course can. And we can reset any of these parameters if you need to. You'll see that when I reset this, sometimes it doesn't always go back to its default. So I just ensure that it is going back to the default when you hit that reset button. You do have a subtractive saturation area in here, and this allows us to increase or decrease the saturation in a subtractive way, which is quite a nice way of adjusting saturation. And we then also have a bleach bypass effect in here. And while I'm not particularly a fan of bleach bypass as an effect, this does have a nice rendition of it. So if you need a quick bleach bypass, you can perform it from here if you want to. As I say, I don't tend to use split toning or vignetting in here. The trouble with the vignette, for example, is while we can change the amount and we can change the size of the vignette, it's just going to be occurring at the corners and edges of the frame. We can't pick the specific place or location for that vignette. If I was going to use vignettes, I would be putting them on my power windows instead. And then we have halation, bloom, and grain. Now, these are 3 settings that I regularly use. So, halation is a characteristic of motion picture film stock and occurs across areas of high contrast, so i.e. when the edges of bright highlights and shadows meet. And this is normally brought about when light moves across the film emulsion and reflects. And this occurs due to a scattering of light across the film stock, and it gives a soft glow around high contrast areas, which can often feel quite dreamlike. So when we go into the halation area, you'll see that we can enable halation. And you'll see as I turn this on and off, you'll start to see it across certain areas of the frame. Now you'll also have a highlights only area, and if you untick this, you'll see the image starts to become quite soft. So I normally always have this ticked. Now we have different parameters that we can change for our halation. We have the amount, and when we adjust this, it's going to increase or decrease the amount of halation available. And we'll specifically be able to see this across this area here. You'll see it's occurring across these brighter regions where there are quite high contrast areas between shadows and bright points. And we can also adjust the radius, and this means the spill. So how far does the halation move out from its original starting point? And you'll see that this halation has quite a yellow tone to it. You'll see that we can also adjust the saturation of the halation to add colour or remove colour. And I normally have this at 1 to keep a lot of the colour. And then we have a hue which shifts it between a yellow and red tone. And I normally have mine closer to a red tone. And you'll now see with all of those parameters adjusted just how drastic this halation can be. But normally less is more, so you want to use this in quite a subtle way. It doesn't need to be overpowering, it just needs to give a slight subtle hint across those contrasted areas. And we can turn this on and off, and you'll see that it's occurring both here and around here, and predominantly around here. And I can turn that on and off again. So this is a really nice halation tool to use, and it works really efficiently. We also have a bloom tool. Now, bloom is another characteristic of motion picture film, and specifically older cinema glass, which had optical imperfections and weaker coating. And nowadays, people try to emulate bloom through things such as Proxies filters, but we can do this digitally in DaVinci Resolve. And when I enable and disable it, you'll see at the moment it's quite a soft blooming effect. And this is again going to occur more toward the brighter highlighted regions. So you'll start to see it here as well. And if I increase the amount, you see it's going to just make those areas bloom and glow a little bit. But you're really going to start seeing it when I start increasing the radius, where that bloom and glow starts to really spill out from its central point. And again, less can be more with this. The radius doesn't need to be exceptionally high. If it is, it can be a bit too overpowering. And with these types of effects, you want to constantly be adjusting them and just turning them on and off to see how they're affecting the overall image. This is maybe a little bit too strong, but I'm going to leave it as it is for this video, just so you can clearly see how it's affecting and adjusting the image. Okay, so after halation and bloom, we also have grain. Now, the grain tool on here is really nice, and we have a range of presets from 65mm to 8mm. And every time we choose one of these different presets, it's going to adjust the amount, size, softness, saturation, and the image defocus. Now, when we go from 65mm to 35mm, you'll see that the grain will become a bit more prominent. And when we go from 16mm, the image will become more prominent in terms of its grain, but it will also start to become softer as well, because that's what normally happens in these 16mm and 8mm formats. When we go to 8mm, you'll start to see the image becomes very soft. Now, this is all to do with the image defocus down here. When we have it set all the way to 0, you'll see the image is very soft, and when we have it set to 1, the image retains its original sharpness. And you'll see that the moment we begin to adjust any of these parameters, our preset changes from the preset to a custom mode. And we can select the custom mode from here. And when we make any adjustments, custom will automatically be selected. This is really useful because if you need to go back to a basic preset and start all over, you can choose one of those presets, pick it, and it will reset those parameters. Generally, I tend to have my image defocus closer to 1 because I don't really want the image to become soft. And I tend to adjust my amount ever so slightly when it's on 35mm, just so it's a little bit smaller. The size, however, I always tend to have quite small. When you have it quite large, it starts to look really unnatural and unrealistic in the shot. You should be able to see that when I increase and decrease the size. If I go to something like 16mm, it's going to make the image very soft, and you'll see that the size is quite large in 16mm. So I tend to stick with either 35 or 65mm, and I start making small adjustments to those parameters. Now, the softness here will determine how crisp the individual pieces of grain are. So, for example, when I go all the way to 1, you'll see that they become very soft and almost invisible in the frame. And when I go all the way down to 0, they start to become much more defined and sharp. Again, on 35, this is at a relatively low value, as is the case with 65mm. And then we also have this saturation point here as well. Now, saturation refers to the colour of the grain. So, for example, if I zoom in closer to here, and I increase the saturation, you'll start to see that the colour grain is coming through. And as we go down to 0, we've got more monochrome grain, so more black and white grain. Now personally, I don't like colour grain. I think it adds too much of a digital effect. So I prefer to have this at a lower value or even all the way to 0. So this grain preset is really useful. It's really capable and it gives a really nice grain emulation. And I would definitely recommend trying it out when you get the chance, because it's going to help add to that overall film aesthetic. And it's going to look different when compared to digital noise. It's going to look much more organic. We then also have a film gate, and the film gate allows us to enable an aspect ratio. So when I click on here, we'll see that a film gate preset is enabled, and we can go into here and choose a variety of 35mm formats, 60mm and 8mm, and our classic 2.4:1 for widescreen. You'll see that when I enable this, we can also have a curvature appear as well, and I can turn this on and off from the Enable Curvature button. And I can manually adjust any of these aspect ratios by just going to the height adjustment area. If I want to bring it back to its default, I'll simply go back to the preset. Now you'll see if I change this to, for example, a 35mm, because I've shot this in widescreen and I've already got cropped bars along the top and bottom, I then get cropped bars along the left and right hand side, and it's going to make the image look a bit strange. However, if I go to the 2.4:1, you'll see that it's now mimicking the same aspect ratio that I'd already shot. And then I've added the little curvature lines into the corners, but I could remove those if I wanted to. So this is really useful that we have these aspect ratios built into this straight from the get-go. At the bottom, we have a global blend area. Now, when this is at 0, it's going to remove any of the effects and color adjustments that we've made in the film look creator, and it's going to decrease all of them. When I go back up to 1, it's going to increase all of those global adjustments. Now, personally, I rarely use this because it's going to be adjusting every single parameter that you set. I normally go into those individual locations and I'll set those specific areas manually to have the intensity or the amount or the radius necessary for that particular effect. Now, we also do have a flicker and a gate weave available here, and I don't tend to use these very often, but they are here if you need them. And flicker generates a soft pulse in the image's exposure and aims to mimic the flicker of a motion picture projector. So when we enable this, if I increase the amount so it's very visible and the rate so it's very visible, when we play this shot, we'll see that we start to get flicker occurring across the screen. And if I decrease this, you'll see that the flicker becomes less prominent. So if you want more of that traditional flicker like you would see from motion picture projectors, you have the option to adjust it here. We then also have a gate weave effect. Now, the gate weave mimics the horizontal and vertical shift which would have occurred when the film stock was mechanically pulled through the camera's gate. And the amount determines the amount of motion performed by the gate weave. And the rate determines the frequency of which the gate weave moves. So for example, if I enable this clip, and again we'll put it high just so it becomes obvious when we're playing the clip back, you can see that as I'm adjusting the rate, that means of which it moves. So when it's a higher value, it's going to move very drastically, and you can see the image is slightly shifting left and right and up and down. Again, if I put this back to the beginning and we play it, you can see the image is now shifting left and right and up and down, and it's got a slight wobble and movement to it, as if it was being pulled through the film's gate. Personally, I don't use this very often, but it is quite a nice feature to have. And again, it would always be less is more with these types of things. You want more of a subtle movement to occur as opposed to a harsh movement, which may be very distracting for the audience. So hopefully that's given you a good breakdown of my updated CST workflow and some of the additional node parameters that I utilize alongside my new node structure to create more of a film aesthetic with that Kodak film print and the film loop creator tool, and how they can be utilized effectively to try and get more of a film print emulation. Hopefully this has been helpful. If you've got any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. As always, keep being creative, and if you like these videos, make sure to like and subscribe, and cheers for watching, and I'll see you soon.